Hi, Scott Shannon again, here to talk about another component of working with MDMA. And this is really looking at the process of working with MDMA. What are the clinical effects? And really, what do we see and what are we hoping to work with in this process? So this is looking at some of the capsules from our phase 2 study going back about 8 years. And this is the study we published in September of this year in Nature Medicine. This is a landmark study. This is the second half of our phase 2 study. I think you've gone through the data before already on this trial, but this was 13 different sites from around the world. And our clinic in Fort Collins was one of these sites. And this was really a very long process for us, and it's now been completed, and we're really looking forward to bringing this into clinical use. So this was a survey of psychiatrists from about 30 years ago, and they surveyed 20 psychiatrists who had been working with MDMA in the years before scheduling. I was actually one of those, although I didn't participate in this survey at the time. But I worked with MDMA from 1983 to 1985 when it was scheduled. And then I had approximately a 30-year hiatus before we picked back up with phase 2 and phase 3 around 2015. But this is a survey of 20 psychiatrists who worked with patients psychotherapeutically with MDMA. And here was their perception of what they saw. Altered perception of time. And I joke with people that this gives you some opportunities for billing adjustments, but that may be a bad joke. Enhanced ability to be open, 85%, decreased defensiveness, decreased fear, increased awareness of emotions, and less aggression. So all these things paint something that's really ideally set up to be a catalyst for psychotherapy. And that's what we see with MDMA. So what does MDMA do? What actually happens when you're sitting across from someone who's ingested MDMA? They feel relaxed. They say, I don't think I've ever felt relaxed. Now, often the first hour, there's a bit of activation that happens with MDMA, and people can feel a little anxious, a little agitated in the first 30 to 60 minutes. We just have people breathe through that and let them know that this will pass. But by the time it's fully in place, like at 60 to 90 minutes, when you're starting to think about a booster dose to help make the effects last longer, people will say, oh, I now feel more relaxed. And that's not universal, but it's close to universal. People feel clear and in control. People are worried they're going to feel out of control. Is it going to be like being really drunk and I'm going to make a fool of myself? Is it going to be like acid and I'm going to be seeing, zebras on the wall? No, none of that. People feel clear, precise, in control. They feel a deep sense of safety. They feel safe physically. They feel safe emotionally. They feel safe on just about every level. I think this is a little bit of the amphetamine-like effect, but probably some serotonin effect. And they also feel connected, trusting, open-hearted. This is likely the oxytocin contribution. People feel a desire to be open, to share, to connect, to be in relationship. We have studies with MDMA showing it really is beneficial for social connectedness in patients with autistic features. And then the defensiveness, the neurotic defenses that we all have that keep us from being open and more loving and available and who we are actually are strikingly absent. And I think this is one reason why MDMA is ideally suited to couples therapy. I did a lot of couples work in the 80s before this was scheduled. And I found it just profoundly helpful for helping marital couples feel closer together, decrease conflicts, and improve a sense of trust and connection. So this is just a little look about how we heal in general, thinking about biological organisms and our homeostatic ability to come to a state of balance and move to a state of order. This is one of the unique properties of life. If you have non-living items, they're in a process of entropy where they're moving to higher and higher levels of disorder. But life with an input of energy, i.e. food and drink, we move to higher levels of order on all levels of our being. Physically, obviously, we can have a cut. It's going to heal without any intervention. And, if you slice up your fingertip, not only does that cut heal, but the fingerprint becomes reconstituted back to its original form. So we have this ability to move back to order and to our potential. But this also happens mentally, emotionally, spiritually. And what we need to do is supply supports and remove barriers and try to limit stressors. So this is really the principles of holistic integrative medicine on working with people on all levels. And MDMA really gives us ability to work emotionally, mentally, spiritually with people, because I think it removes barriers to healing. It offers some supports and allows us to work through trauma, work through defenses, work through rigid coping skills, and move to a different place. And if we look specifically how we heal from trauma, there's a number of common pathways that we can see. This is, I think, in some ways clear from work with exposure therapy. It's clear from work with EMDR. It's clear from work with MDMA. We see a lot of shared principles in this. First of all, we need to really digest trauma. That's the main problem. Most of us encounter trauma in our lives all the time, and we digest it and we move on. And it's not PTSD. It's not a big deal. Most people that face trauma do not develop PTSD. Now, as trauma gets more and more severe, those numbers may increase. But even at the most severe levels of insult, not everybody develops PTSD. And that's what's interesting is, I remember the Chowchilla bus kidnappings, I think of the early 1990s, where a number of kids, 20 or 30 kids, were kidnapped in a bus in California and held hostage in the desert. And at the end of this, some of the kids had PTSD, some of the kids had acute stress reaction, and some were, that was a bad time, I'm ready to get back to my life. And that's what happens to us. And we don't really understand this varied vulnerability to trauma, but it's present. We can call it ego strength, but we don't really understand what it is. One of the common threads that we see in all these different trauma works is people seem to do better if they re-experience the trauma and move through it and accept it, work through it. So in our work with MDMA, we're often curious about when people are re-experiencing and what they flow through. People gain a sense of safety and peace that they've not had before. And it's really one of the helpful pieces as you work through trauma is you realize you've been demoralized. Your morale is low, your sense of optimism is gone, your sense of personal agency is eroded. And so getting your morale back is really one of the cores of this. I think another piece, we'll talk about this in a little bit, is we don't define ourselves any longer as a damaged person. A lot of people with PTSD have this narrative that they're damaged somehow because they've had multiple occasions, repeated occasions where they can't successfully engage in life because of their PTSD. And I think one of the things that happens as it starts to change, digest, move through, is you're able to see the trauma in more of a context. It's like, that was a bad thing that happened. That was 20 years ago. That was Iraq. I'm not there anymore. Whatever the process is, you realize that it's in the past and it's not relevant. It's not current. It's not active. And then, I think moving through the emotional response of this, moving through anger, moving through resentment, and trying to get to a place, maybe not always of forgiveness, but at least of acceptance. And that's really what we hope to see as people heal from trauma. So some real similarities, regardless of the mode that you work with. And then I think finally for this section, we can look at the value and resonance of these two models, psychedelic psychotherapy, the psychedelic paradigm, if you will, and integrative holistic medicine. They both really come from the same philosophical underpinnings. They both really had their start in the 1960s. And interestingly enough, you might speculate, obviously, that integrative holistic medicine was also a product of the psychedelic era, and that people saw health in a different way, rather than seeing it in this very narrow reductionistic perspective, all of a sudden stepping back and seeing the broad sweep of life and how we support and protect it. So both of these models endorse knowing the whole person. They are generous with care, love, and support. They believe in the inner healer and trust the inner healing process. And that's one of the things that we're constantly doing with MDMA, LSD, psilocybin, ketamine. We're letting people go inside and we're trusting the inner process. And one of the critical things for you as a practitioner is you need to embrace, feel, and hold that same level of trust if you're going to be an effective container and therapeutic crucible for the patient that you're working with. So we want to move away from dependency, symptom suppression models, and whether that's benzodiazepines, SSRIs. These are things that people have to take on a daily basis just to suppress their symptoms. And then finally, both endorse the power of our spirit to catalyze deep change. And whether that happens through near-death experiences, a spontaneous religious event, or an encounter with psychedelics, the underlying process is the same. It's our spirit that reflects outward and comes to expression. And I think that's one of the attractions for this psychedelic paradigm, is it honors the power of our spirit and the presence of our spirit. Our current model is a pathologically based model which doesn't honor spirit or our inner healer. And I think it's really time for us to move to a different place. And luckily we're doing that. And I think MDMA is a great example of that process. So we'll end there and jump into the third segment here in a little bit.